To begin, scholars have long focused on representations of shell-shocked male soldiers who fought during the World Wars in fiction by both male and female British authors from the early 20th century. Recently, however, they have begun to pay attention to modernist female authors' emphasis on women's hardships, both on the home front as wives and mothers, and at work in the war efforts as employees. For instance, Virginia Woolf famously connects the trauma of the war veteran Septimus Smith with the disappointments of the society hostess Clarissa Dalloway in her novel Mrs. Dalloway. In their ghost stories, modernist women writers use the supernatural to highlight the trauma of women and children who suffer from family violence rather than the shell-shocked male soldiers, as we might expect. Authors such as H.D. Everett and Elizabeth Bowen associate the mass devastation of both world wars with the patriarchal society that normalized violence against women and children in the intimate sphere of the home. My paper will investigate how Everett and Bowen's portrayals of women's encounters with the supernatural bring to light the hidden female trauma of domestic violence and child abuse in early 20th century England and Scotland. In the only study on Everett's work, Melissa Edmondson McCullough identifies the importance of women's wartime trauma in Everett's ghost stories, but she overlooks this theme in Everett's tale Neville Nugent's Legacy, published in 1920. In this work, Everett uses the figure of a victimized child ghost murdered by his stepfather to criticize Scottish society for normalizing violence against young boys as well as working-class women. Bowen's well-known tale, The Demon Lover, published in 1945, illustrates the overlap in women's position as traumatized subjects between the two world wars through the perspective of the main character, Kathleen Drover. The bombing of Kathleen's house during the Battle of Britain triggers her memories of losing her domineering fiancé during the World War I. The trauma of their relationship materializes as a demonic ghost that kidnaps Kathleen. Both ghost stories use the backdrop of the World Wars to underscore the dangerous effects of male aggression and its link to family violence against oppressed populations such as women and children. As previously mentioned, Melissa Edmondson McCullough argues that the supernatural represents female wartime trauma in Everett's ghost stories. She says, quote, "Like Everett's ghosts, most women were liminal beings during the war, perpetually occupying an in-between space because they experienced the trauma of war, but were apart from the actual fighting." However, McCullough completely overlooks the Everett's association of the trauma of family violence for women and children and its association with shell shock from masculine wartime aggression in Neville Nugent's Legacy. The narrator, Margaret Campbell, recounts how when her husband, Kenneth, quote, "came out of the hospital last January so ill and broken, my work," her wartime work, "had to stop, for I was needed to nurse him. Ever since then, the money has been flowing out with only a little trickling in. So little I cried over it only last night, of course when Ken did not see." While Kenneth's illness is unspecified, his ill and broken condition suggests he could be suffering from shell shock after fighting in the war. We see the huge economic and psychological toll that male trauma takes on women, such as Margaret, because she ends up unemployed and penniless taking care of her husband. The answer to their financial struggle comes in the form of surprise inheritance from Kenneth's estranged relative Neville Nugent, namely the Scottish property of Mirkmoor. The Campbells are happy with their inheritance until they learn of its financial burdens, including an annuity and permanent home for Mirkmoor's housekeeper, Mrs. Wilding. Margaret ponders, quote, "A curious provision this, if you come to think of it, and it will be odd for us, for me, with a servant in the house over whom I have no authority, as it is her home by as clear right as it will be my own." Neville's special provisions for Miss Wilding initially make her a suspicious character because this arrangement inverts the power dynamic between mistress and maid. Holly Blackford notes that 20th century Gothic fiction, such as the novel Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, pits mistress and maid against each other in competing for control of the house. Despite this, Margaret reports that Mrs. Wilding, quote, "seemed anxious to be attentive, and I was ready to like her, only it gave me a chill at heart to see her face, from which all hopes seemed to have gone out." That night, Margaret's focus on her son Tom and her sympathy for Mrs. Wilding cause her to have a nightmare. In her nightmare, Margaret confuses the ghost of Mrs. Wilding's son Martin calling for his mother, with Tom calling for her. Martin's supernatural call for his mother from the chapel room where his stepfather Bassett has buried him draws on Margaret's maternal instincts by making her worry that her own son is in trouble. Martin's appeal to Margaret's maternal position not only captures her attention so she can help Mrs. Wilding, but it also allows both women to overcome their class conflict and bond over their shared experience as mothers. Margaret must help Mrs. Wilding because Mrs. Wilding remains unaware that her son has been dead for the past 8 years and still hopes that they will be reunited. During her house tour, Margaret meets Mrs. Wilding's husband, Bassett, who has been crippled by Martin's ghost in revenge for the murder and for misusing his strength to harm others. Ironically, Bassett disturbs the cozy image of the family hearth by trying to beat his wife's dog with a stick. Critics have noted that Victorian authors often drew a connection between animal abuse and family violence because in both cases men mistreated vulnerable groups such as women, children, and animals out of a sense of ownership. Although his disability makes him as vulnerable as the animals and children he has brutalized, Bassett's murderous attack on his wife's dog shows that he remains unrepentant even after he has been punished by his stepson's ghost. Mrs. Wilding informs Margaret, quote, "I have taken back my former name because I will no longer be called by his." Hence, he's called Bassett, she's called Mrs. Wilding, which shows that she is emotionally divorced from her abusive husband. Mrs. Wilding reveals that her inability to protect Martin from Bassett's savage beatings placed pressure on Martin to leave one abusive environment by joining the Navy so that he could someday take care of her. Although Martin cannot keep his promise, he appeals to Margaret to help his mother leave Bassett even after Bassett no longer poses a threat, since his wife is still trapped taking care of him. Mrs. Wilding offers a radical critique of how British society enables family violence through granting men authority in the home when she tells Margaret, quote, "Ma'am, they say that marriage is an honorable estate and a married woman is respectable. I thought, but I say now that the worst day's work that I ever did and the wickedest was when I married and thought it would be good for me to be married to Bassett. To give him power over myself, body and soul, was bad enough, he being what he was. But the sin was to give him power over my child. I thought, but I say now that the worst day's work that ever I did." Mrs. Wilding's discarding of her husband's last name is already a notable rejection of marriage and a reclamation of her autonomy, but she goes even further in speaking to her mistress about her experience of family violence. She delivers an explicit condemnation of the institutions of marriage, family life, and social class for perpetuating the suffering of women and children in post-war Scotland. Her rejection of what they say about the respectability of marriage and describing it as wicked, sinful, and bad indicates the pressure women feel to marry for social acceptance, as well as her feelings of guilt for failing to protect her son. Mrs. Wilding is extremely critical of the legal power that men wield over their wives and children, and her anger suggests that the laws were still not advanced enough to protect these populations from violence as of 1920. Despite setting her ghost story in Scotland rather than England, Everett presents this colonial territory as being similar to England in terms of reinforcing the inequalities that promote family violence. In fact, Everett indicts all of Scottish society for institutionalizing violence against young boys and links it to the mass trauma of World War I. Through the space of the chapel room where Martin's body is buried. Originally, Neville Nugent builds the space so that he could preach his eccentric religious doctrines there, but he never gets a chance because Martin's ghost is haunting this space. Next, Bassett treats this room like an extension of his brutal domestic sphere at the Grange, because it's in the same house, by burying Martin's body there after murdering him. Once Neville leaves, a schoolmaster named Mr. Grant opens a boys' school in the chapel room and employs Mrs. Wilding as a matron to the young boys in his tutelage. Besides punishing his stepfather, Martin disables Mr. Grant with a fit in order to protect the schoolboys from corporal punishment and end Mr. Grant's reign of terror over them. The fact that boys are beaten in the home, the Navy, and the school shows the systematic nature of child abuse as well as critiques Edwardian society for normalizing this mistreatment. Margaret reports that Kenneth, quote, had just received an offer for the chapel room from a certain contractor who would take the room down at his own expense to re-erect for some purpose connected to the war. Everett links the institutionalized violence against young boys with the mass devastation of World War I by showing that the trauma of family violence is the same trauma as shell shock. Despite this link between child abuse and war trauma, Martin does not appear to Kenneth as the traumatized soldier who would relate to Martin's pain, because the ghost is not concerned about receiving help for himself. Instead, Martin appeals to Margaret so she will help Mrs. Wilding leave her abusive husband and become a survivor of abuse. Martin's assistance with discovering his body allows Mrs. Wilding to have closure and to bring her husband to justice. Margaret significantly relates, quote, Mrs. Wilding has charged her husband and will give evidence against him in court, and the wretch has been taken away. She says she hopes he will be hanged, but Ken thinks it is not likely the law will go to that extreme, as he is not in his right mind. But he will be shut up as a criminal lunatic for what is left to him of life. Neville has ensured that Mrs. Wilding can leave Bassett by giving her an annuity and a home in the Grange, but she still needs Margaret's support to reestablish her independence. With Margaret's encouragement, Mrs. Wilding takes a radical stance in not only freeing herself from her abuser, but also punishing him by testifying in court against him. The chance to confide in Margaret about her traumatic experiences allows Mrs. Wilding to break her silence as a victim and publicly testify about her abusive marriage. The prompt action of the police and courts in bringing justice shows how wife and child protection was being taken seriously, even though Scottish society has a large room for improvement in this area. Margaret's parting gesture of creating a cross of lilies, which is also the flower of the Virgin Mary, for Mrs. Wilding to lay on Martin's grave emphasizes how their shared bond as loving mothers has brought mistress and servant together. In the next story, Elizabeth Bowen's The Demon Lover bridges the gap between the two world wars through the experience of the main character, a middle-aged wife and mother named Kathleen Drover. As Tony Reed explains, Bowen's title refers to a traditional literary and folkloric motif of the demon lover, an aggressive ghost that comes to destroy a living woman. In Bowen's story, the demon lover is identified as Kathleen's dead fiancé, a young man who went missing while fighting in World War I. This identification suggests an explicit link between wartime violence and the demon's abusive behavior toward Kathleen. As the story opens, Kathleen returns to her house in London to collect some belongings. The narrator describes the destruction inflicted on the house during the Battle of Britain from Kathleen's perspective. Quote, there were some cracks in the structure left by the last bombing on which she was anxious to keep an eye. Not that one could do anything, end quote. The representation of the damaged house highlights the physical trauma that the war has caused throughout England at the time the story is set, specifically 1941. Kathleen's worry about the damage to the house and the frequent association of women with the domestic sphere at the time suggests that Bowen is concerned with more than just the physical effects of the war. Similar to the house, Kathleen's experience of living through World War II has left her mentally traumatized and completely defenseless against being hurt because she cannot protect herself as a civilian. Her psychic distress emerges more clearly when she finds a note left by the demon lover informing Kathleen that he will return to claim her on the day of their anniversary now that she has returned to London, which happens to be that day. So the note says, quote, in view of the fact that nothing has changed, I shall rely upon you to keep your promise. I was sorry to see you leave London, but was satisfied that you would be back in time. You may expect me, therefore, at the hour arranged. After reading the note, Kathleen flashes back to when she last saw her fiancé in August 1916 and promised that she would wait for him come to reclaim her. Bowen points out the irony of the demon lover's claim that nothing has changed when Kathleen reflects that she has married and had a family in the 25 years since her fiancé went missing. Kathleen's trauma at living through one war has rekindled her traumatic experiences of the early war in the form of a possessive and controlling demon lover bent on destroying her. Kathleen resents that her fiancé made her promise eternal devotion to him when she was only 19, because he forced Kathleen to follow his wishes without caring about her desires. Kathleen muses that, quote, he was never kind to me, not really. I don't remember him kind at all. Mother said he never considered me. He was set on me, and that was that, not love. not love, not meaning a person well. Her fiancé's resolve to claim her even after death terrifies Kathleen so much that the story takes on an eerie overtone as she longs to run away from the demon lover stalking her, much like a female victim fleeing an abusive partner. Bowen adds a chilling twist to the archaic demon lover motif when Kathleen takes a taxi, only to find that the driver is the demon lover come to take her captive. The continuity between past and present in Bowen's story shows us that the subjection of women and children to male aggression remained a continuing problem in England during the interwar years. In conclusion, the context of masculine aggression during both world wars allowed female authors like Everett and Bowen to bring attention to the problem of family violence against women and children in early 20th century England and Scotland. While both authors use contemporary historical events to highlight the trauma of domestic violence victims, they differ in their views of whether survivors can come to terms with their pain. For Everett, abused characters like Mrs. Wilding can move beyond victim status and break their silence as well as escape their male oppressors with the help of Margaret and Martin's ghost. In contrast, Bowen portrays Kathleen Drover being destroyed by her traumatic memories of her controlling fiancé, even though she has lived as a survivor for the past 25 years. Ultimately, both authors overlook or demonize the soldiers afflicted with shell shock during the World Wars in order to expose the invisible experiences of women and children who silently endured the trauma of violence. Thank you.